Okay, I guess we start now, as the time is very limited. So welcome everyone who just joined us to this workshop on how we can work towards a more equitable and safer nightlife for underrepresented and marginalized communities in the night. My name is Lewamm Ghebremariam, you can call me Lou, and I'm a senior political campaign strategist with Change.org in Germany. I am based in Berlin, and I'm also a board member of the Berlin Club Commission. I think you just met my colleague, Lutz. And with that said, my co-leads today are...
Hi, my name's Lo. I'm a research fellow at the UCL Urban Lab in London.
Hi, I'm Tara Duvivier. I'm a senior planner at Pratt Center for Community Development in Brooklyn, New York.
Thank you too. So before we get into what we can actually do to take a step and to work towards a more equitable nightlife, we want to take a step back and ask three very important questions. So why are we doing this? Why does it matter? And where are we standing actually today in our sorry, someone not muted right now. And where are we standing today in having like a more equitable nightlife space? So we just did the introductions. This is where we're at. You can enter your thoughts on it before we get into it in the public chat if you want. It's also nice to know who you are, just so we have a little bit of friendly getting to know each other. That would be great. So in order to get a clearer vision of who we are and where we are today, I'm going to tap into privilege as a self-awareness key. For most people hearing about privilege, it sounds very threatening, as it challenges the very power we hold. Today, we want to just ignite. Sorry, can we mute that person? It's very disturbing.
I think it's Merrick.
Thank
it's
you.
Merrick's mic.
Yeah, in order to get a clearer vision, that's where we are. So today we just want you to just ignite that thought about which areas do you have privilege in, and how can we actually leverage that to give power to those who are less privileged in the night, right? So I'm going to tap into that flower. So what do you see here is just any flower that you can imagine, and certain parts of your identity are basically closer to the center and certain parts are further out. Like you're born, like in my case, I'm a Black cis woman, and at some point in my life I found out I was queer, and my parents come from a very low socioeconomic background. We were refugees, so I was kind of further out, like when you think about the flower petals, than other people in my community. Like, for example, a white German-born and raised able-bodied boy in my school. He was very, very much closer to this time. And as you grow up and as you evolve, as you go to uni, etc., you can actually work, and that's also very neoclassical if you want. You can work towards getting that illusion of working hard to get to power. But it is true that, for example, in my case, I went to university, I became a board member with the club commission. So I heard, I after a few years, whatever, I actually accumulated a little bit of power and got closer to the center where the most of the power is held, right? So as we move on, I just want you to think about where you are situated on that flower of privilege. Are you closer to the center, or are you further out? Okay. And yes, and then a second aspect of why does it even matter? Why are we tapping into this? Why are we talking about it? Is that there are many dimensions of discrimination today, but when people hear about discrimination, they mostly jump into the individual layer. So in my case, they would ask me like, "Oh, have you been called names?" Or they want to get into, I guess, personal experiences. But what people forget to talk about is that let's focus on racial discrimination. That there are 4 dimensions, right? And these dimensions, I just entered a visual that I learned about from Dr. Emilia Roig. She's a researcher at Center for Intersectional Justice in Berlin. And I felt like this really explains it the best. So when people want to learn about racism or any kind of discrimination, they go to the individual who are experiencing it and they ask about, like, what are your experiences? Have you, let's say you're a club owner, you would be like, but people haven't told me that they've experienced kind of racial or any kind of discrimination in my space, right? So you also put pressure on the marginalized community to explain a structure that is not just the individual experience, but institutional, historical, and structural experience in discrimination, right? And when I say historical discrimination, we could use an example, say, Haiti was a colonized country by the French, and they had to buy themselves out of slavery. So their starting point, you know, of the actual inhabitants of Haiti is a different one than, let's say, the Germans that were colonizers, not in that space, but in general. And there is this still, this idea still that people who come from countries like Haiti or African countries and move to Germany, that they're just very lazy people. But their starting point is a difference. And the Germans are very hardworking, right? So there is a historical, nuance to where people start off in life. And also when we think about structural racism or discriminations, sometimes it's that people basically unintentionally, that's another thing, right? Unintentionally, reperpetrate structures that have been there historically or have already been institutionalized, and they kind of become blind to the discrimination that then an individual faces. So, and today, that's where we're going to go at. We want to just kind of look about these 4 dimensions and try and balance them out. So if you hold a certain privileged position and you're at the table with other club owners, policymakers, etc., you can look into the room and say, okay, why is it that a certain person is not represented at this table? Because a way out of this, and my co-leads are going to go get more into it, is to see who's at this table that are like deciding on how we are moving towards a more equitable nightlife. Okay. And yeah, finally, I just want you to kind of take this picture as well with you. As I said, giving everyone the same is not what is kind of like unbalancing or like straightening out what was there historically, institutionally, and structurally, but we need to see how we can redistribute resources to those who are marginalized in nightlife, but also in every aspect of society. So with that said, I'm going to give it to Lo.
Hi there. So what can we do? How do we measure problems to address them? And who's doing the measuring and who's accountable? So we see the use of targets and measures and indicators in a bunch of different initiatives at different scales. So sustainable development goals, for example, are something that we're probably, most of us here are familiar with. I'm going to talk about a London-based example that I've got direct experience of being involved with, which is threats and closures to LGBTQ nightlife venues in London. And obviously this is a specific example, but I hope you'll see wider relevance to the context that you're thinking about and living in as well, and see the potential of collaboration, of solidarity and understanding across difference, and leveraging our positions and our privileges, like Lou's been speaking about, to help address problems around safety and inequity within nightlife spaces. So LGBTQ spaces are valuable to many within the community in fostering community and belonging, well-being, enabling the exploration of gender and sexuality, political and organising, and supporting and engaging with queer cultures, amongst many other things. In London around 2015-2016, and as you'll see on this slide, there was widespread reporting and campaigning around LGBTQ venues being increasingly under threat and closing, but evidence of what was actually driving this was quite anecdotal and quite isolated. So for meaningful interventions to be made by City Hall, the Mayor's Office, by borough councils, in assisting activists, we needed a more robust evidence base. So in response, my colleague, Professor Ben Campkin, and I, who are both based at the UCL Urban Lab, designed some pilot research in collaboration with LGBTQ collectives, networks and campaigns who are organising around protecting queer spaces in London. We were then commissioned by the Mayor of London's culture team to develop this work. In particular, we were commissioned to audit openings and closures of LGBTQ nighttime venues since 2006. And this was part of wider evidence gathering at City Hall on what they termed culture at risk. And it was around this time that Amy LeMay was appointed as London's Night Czar. And so we can see at this point a kind of shift towards City Hall really taking seriously and investing in the contribution of nighttime economies and cultures in London. Our research showed a 58% fall in the number of LGBTQ venues in London between 2006 and 2017, which was when we published a report, hence the kind of strange 11-year time period. And this next slide shows the data mapped by the Mayor of London. And it sits here alongside other mapping of cultural infrastructure, and it's publicly available online. And in comparison to other kind of culture at risk and cultural infrastructure that was captured, we saw a higher instances of LGBT venues closing compared to, for example, grassroots live music venues, which are also struggling in London. The evidence in our research suggested that threats and closures to LGBTQ venues were often the consequences of neoliberal urban policy and governance and related processes of redevelopment, regeneration and gentrification. So, for example, the impact of large-scale developments on venues and clusters of venues, even on sudden rent hikes, the lack of implementing safeguarding measures that are already in the planning system, and sort of change of use and the sale of property by landlords. Actually, we found that the number of venue closures that was linked to just going out of business-rated financial issues was actually pretty low. It was also really clear that operators and customers who came together to campaign for venues to stay open had really severely limited negotiating powers compared to these large private organisations who are driving developments. So this data set, this work on venues, offers a really important view and perspective and knowledge, but it's also a partial view of spaces and patterns that are the most easily mappable, those venues that are permanent, that we can easily trace. But it raises questions of who holds the privilege of operating and feeling included and safe within these permanent spaces, including LGBTQ spaces. We need to think about the dynamics within them. So we needed more nuanced understandings of how inequalities work within LGBT communities and how these are spatialized within nightlife. And so we actually researched kind of beyond the commission of our brief to be able to include this information. And doing this highlighted the lack of LGBTQ venues that centre women, trans people and people of colour, and obviously these are groups that intersect. LGBTQ venues were and continue to be predominantly owned and used by white cisgender gay men, and LGBTQ nightlife, as you can see on this slide, certainly exists where it centres women, trans folks and people of colour, but exists mostly in the form of events that take place both within LGBTQ venues and other venues across the city. And this is partly due to closures, particularly where women-centred venues are concerned, but it also reflects like longer absences. And these established and newly emerging collectives around the time of our research, collectives of performers and promoters, were putting on club nights that sought to redress exclusions that they'd often experienced directly within wider LGBTQ nightlife scenes around racism, transphobia and misogyny particularly. So how can this knowledge be put to work? So concerning our research, making data available to campaigns and publicly accessible on the government website has been used by multiple campaigns to help make a case for some often successfully, and secure the protection and re-provision of venues that have either been closed or put under threat. The LGBTQ Venue Forum was established following the research, and it's chaired by the Night Tsar, and it facilitates conversations between venue operators and nightlife promoters and City Hall. So there's a sharing of challenges, ways of addressing those challenges, and it offers a direct line into the Mayor's office and to the Night Tsar. And when COVID happened, this became a really important piece of infrastructure when venues were really struggling under lockdown. Monitoring. So City Hall are responsible for maintaining the data set that we created. And this is part of and a main aspect of how they're able to measure and monitor the kind of health, if you like, of London's LGBTQ scenes where venues are concerned. And it's remained fairly stable since 2017. Planning protections. So the planning system has become an incredibly important space in terms of protecting and re-providing venues, particularly at the level of boroughs within London who have more planning powers than the Mayor's office itself. And challenges brought by campaigns through the planning system using our evidence base have secured the protection of venues and the re-provision of venues where they've been threatened by private development. And this is involved in certain cases included the rejection of certain applications, as well as including within the planning conditions that an LGBTQ venue has to be re-provided, and stipulating that a developer has to assist in the funding of the refurbishment of that space and subsidise rent for a period of time. And then finally, an LGBTQ venue charter. There's so much I could say about the uses and limitations of this that I don't have time for, but essentially it's in many ways a soft power tool, so that people can sign up to this voluntary charter. But also in these cases where we have protections for LGBTQ venues being written into planning systems, having a criteria enables a level of accountability that new leaseholders and developers need to be held to. So to sum up quickly, hopefully I've shown the value of targets and indicators, but also the imperative of combining this with qualitative approaches that offer more nuanced understandings of issues around safety and equity that really demand more than key performance indicators on their own can offer, as valuable as they can be. And although with collaborations, there are sort of certain tensions inevitably arise, I think there really are productive possibilities for collaborations across sectors, as well as working with our own sphere to create more safe and equitable nightlife for marginalised and underrepresented communities. I'll hand over to Tara here.
Tara, I think you're mute. There we go. Brilliant.
Of course, of course I had to do that. So I'll start again. Hi, everyone. What we're going to talk about now is how we can implement this, or at least one thing that we can potentially implement in all of this, and just talking about the work that I've been doing so far. Slide. All right, so I do work in New York City nightlife as a DJ and a sometimes event producer, but my main job is a senior planner at Pratt Center for Community Development, which is within Pratt Institute, which is a university for art, architecture, planning, and design. Pratt Center has a vision for a more just city and partners with local communities, small businesses, and the public sector to work towards this goal. A more equitable New York City is something that I've been working towards in some capacity for over a decade, either working in affordable housing development or working on land use policy in New York City. This is not working for me. All right. So I was able to finally apply this work to nightlife last year as part of the Global Nightlife Recovery Plan. I led the chapter that presented the challenges nightlife workers are experiencing due to the pandemic, and presented support models for workers to make the labor economy more resilient and sustainable during this pandemic and beyond. So when we talk about nightlife workers, it was really important for us to note who we were talking about when we say that. It's not just DJs and promoters. We understand that there is an entire ecosystem of different types of folks that work within nightlife that support the industry. So one of the things that we did note in our chapter, and we had this really great infographic, I really just wanted to put it up there for people to understand. I do think that when we think of nightlife, we think of just the main acts. We don't realize that people down from the security to people who clean the spaces are essential workers within that space. We did a global survey in order to understand what nightlife workers were experiencing with a relatively small sample. We had about over 300 respondents, and we learned that to the right are the top 3 needs that were reported. For the most part, cash and rent. 98% of those that responded, they were able to receive some monetary relief, but they reported that it was not enough to sustain themselves. Many of them reported declining mental health. In many cases, people didn't just lose their jobs, they really lost safe social space for themselves, as many people that do work within nightlife are part of groups that do not have the privilege of entering most spaces without being over-policed, discriminated against, and possibly attacked. So I wanted to bring up, in the United States, we have the National Independent Venue Association, or NIVA. It was created to organize and advocate for independent music venues on a national level to push for federal legislation that would keep venues open. NIVA was created in March 2020. Their partnerships with local and state governments and raising awareness through high-profile artists who got their start in these venues resulted in the Save Our Spaces Act being passed in late 2020. I wanted to reiterate here that NIVA was created in March 2020. Not even a year into the pandemic, they were able to get federal legislation passed and money for venues to access. Applications for grant money for shuttered venues was launched this past week, or last week rather, taking in 17,000 applications in the first 24 hours. So this brings us to one of the items that we identified in our particular chapter of the Global Nightlife Recovery chapter. Venues were able to organize nationally and work quickly to help one another and raise awareness to their issues during the pandemic. There is some privilege here in being a small business and really being able to organize and get elected officials behind them with figures and data. And while some cities have put a monetary value on the nightlife economy, it is an acknowledgement more of the venues and the businesses that support nightlife, but not the workers themselves. While some nightlife workers are unionized based off their specific occupation, which you find primarily with musicians that work within nightlife, most nightlife workers are not organized. And there are reasons for this. Some of this includes a fear of retaliation or blacklisting for trying to organize, potentially ending their careers and shutting them out of their social networks, a lack of understanding or education around organizing, nightlife being underground. So you have populations within nightlife that have a justified mistrust of the establishment. They prefer anonymity and they don't want any government participation of any kind. And then there's the overall fear of over-policing. The more you invite government in, there's a general concern around more regulation and more policing. I know in New York City, many nightlife spaces that are owned by people of color or are sited in neighborhoods with large population with people of color are often more policed than other spaces. So just in thinking in terms of myself as a nightlife worker and the experiences that I myself have dealt with, as well as others that I work with, these are just some of the issues that we're dealing with in New York City specifically. None of, these are just a few, and all of these existed prior to the pandemic. And I know that there are similar issues being experienced in other cities around the world. There are barriers that are preventing large-scale organizing around these issues from happening. We need to remove those barriers and help raise awareness and encourage and facilitate organizing opportunities so we can build a nightlife economy that is inclusive, safe, sustainable, and equitable. Thank you.
Sorry, I had a little issue with my speaker. Yeah, so thank you for the input, and we want now to go into I think 2 breakout rooms and kind of see or like work together and see how we can inform from what we just learned, like how can you in your area, whatever you work in, kind of implement small things that bring us closer to an equitable nightlife, basically. Lo, Tara, do you think we should split the group, or what's your...
I don't know, I think we could, there's about 20 of us here, so we could probably have a conversation together. What do you reckon? Yeah, so it would be great to hear if anyone's got any comments or questions or anything to share from their own perspectives and experiences based on the presentations Lou and Tara and I have given.